Congressman.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome tonight. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea where we've come from with this issue, a little history of it from a congressional perspective. I was asked to do that, and then offer what I know where we're at, although, of course, your folks will know a whole lot more to give more in-depth updates following this. But let me just share how we got involved in Congress on this issue. So we have a family friend, my husband and I, in Colorado, who found that she had gone to a lot of doctors for a number of ailments, but one in particular, and wasn't getting resolution, and she discovered Kratom, and it was one of the few things that really helped her, and that's where I first heard about it, so from a good family friend. And when we heard that this ban was going on in place, we actually reached out to the American Kratom Association to say, hey, is there something we might do? Because often in Congress we do letters and we try to get members to have an agency look at something maybe a little differently than they're looking at it. And this was back in September, might even been late August last year of 2016. At that time, Susan Ash and your lobbyist at the time came by my office in Washington. We talked more and more about it and kind of came up with a path we thought might make sense. In the past, I've had a good experience with congressional letters. Let's face it, legislation doesn't pass a whole lot these days in Congress, but we do have letters. And I thought it was really important that if we were going to try to make sure the DEA wasn't going to expedite the scheduling of Kratom, which is what they were doing at the time, we should get this letter going. So I recommended to your lobbyist at the time that we should find a Republican. A bipartisan letter is always better, even though we had a Democratic president, we had a Republican Congress. Bipartisan is always good. And we wound up finding Matt Salmon, a representative from Arizona, to co-lead the letter. We circulated it, talked to some of our colleagues, and for a letter like this, I was very, very impressed with the turnout. Often you might have 15, 20 colleagues sign something. We actually got 50 colleagues, 50, 22 Republicans, 28 Democrats, so a really good bipartisan split that we sent a letter on September 30th of that year, and that I thought was really positive. On the Senate side, there also was a group of 11 senators who sent a letter, and that was led by Orrin Hatch from Utah, so a Republican in the Senate. So I thought, we approached it in the right direction, and we basically said, hey, you're doing this without, you're trying to schedule Kratom as a Schedule 1 drug. You're doing this without any public comment whatsoever. At the time, the acting administrator of the DEA was Chuck Rosenberg, and we wanted to make sure that they did the right thing. So we put the letter out, and on October 13th, about, I'm trying to think from the date, it must have been about a couple of weeks later, they announced that they were going to withdraw the expedited scheduling and that they would solicit public comments through the end of the year, through December. I believe it was the end of the year, but it was December 2016. And while that doesn't stop any future threats at that point to the DEA scheduling Kratom as a Schedule 1, it was an important win at the time because at least we put a pause on it. We acknowledged that they needed to have information from the scientific community to understand what was going on, and they could more fully have the interaction between the DEA and the FDA because we were having some interaction problems with both of the agencies. Interestingly, my gut, and I'm not sure if this is, I can't say this is 100% certainty, but my gut told me what was going around this time was synthetic heroin was being sold in stores, and one of the elements that was brought into it was Kratom. So I think what happened is some over-ambitious and not necessarily scientifically minded folks decided that anything that was made up in a synthetic heroin must be bad, and I think that's how this whole process started. I can't say it definitively, they've never told us that. There were some reports of some people who died from other things, but happened to have Kratom in their system, very small number. But I'm quite sure it had something to do with the other, just from my interactions with agencies over the years. So now, we've had the public comment. We've been kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. Most recently, I now serve on the Appropriations Committee, and on the Agriculture Subcommittee, we have oversight over the FDA. And we had the new FDA Commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, in, who I believe had been in for like 2 weeks. But to be honest, he was very, very knowledgeable for someone who's been there for 2 weeks. Of course, he had experience previously with the agency, but very impressed with where he was at for, again, 2 weeks experience. and I asked him a question during that hearing about whether or not the FDA was going to be doing their 8-factor analysis on Kratom, which is how the DA is supposed to go through a process to actually schedule a drug like that, and they said they were moving forward with the analysis. Now, we know that there has been, by your association, an independent analysis that was very thorough and very thoughtful and has been submitted, so that, you know, if they do the same as this, I think you're going to find that people are going to realize that, you know, obviously it shouldn't be a Schedule I drug, and we're hoping to have progress on that. So I think, Dave, you know, I just wanted to offer that brief history, I think, is what you asked me to do. I'd be glad if you have a question or two to take that, but I wanted to at least provide people with a little bit of a timeline of what's happened, the unusual nature of a bipartisan letter in both houses moving this forward, and the fact that we're still pushing on this and trying to make sure they know we haven't, you know, forgot about it, that it's still something important, and that we don't want to have this be improperly listed as a Schedule I drug.
Congressman, thank you. We can't tell you how much we appreciate your support and help. In researching questions, there was one that kept coming up over and over again, so let me just ask it to you.
Sure.
What can the Kratom community do to help you as a member of Congress to preserve and protect the freedoms of consumers to have access to Kratom in the future? That's the big burning issue.
Sure. You know, I'll tell you, more than ever, you know, it's contacting your member of Congress and your senator. If you have a personal story, all the better. But, you know, it's not the mass-produced postcards, generic emails that all say the same. Those get lost, I'll be real honest. But what gets our attention is when a thoughtful letter, a thoughtful email, it's the same these days, the same as a thoughtful letter, or a phone call to either the district office or the Washington, D.C. office of your member of Congress and your senator. Quite honestly, other members probably won't take the calls because we all have over 700,000 constituents and we have limited staff. But if you make that call and just say, hey, look, we're still watching this issue, we hope you will too, maybe you could reach out to the DEA or the FDA would probably be the right person at this point. Honestly, whatever Dave tells you is the message you should send on it, but what I'm suggesting is it's that communication with your elected officials so that it's still on their radar screen, their staff's radar screens. And if you have an ask, that'd be great, because if they could make a call or send a letter individually, to this point, I don't think there's a group letter that needs to happen. You know, we work with your association. If there is, we'll jointly figure that out. But for now, I think just making sure they know you're available, you know, that you're someone in the district who cares about it. And one caveat, I know I said a good letter, and a good letter does make a difference. However, because of the problem with sarin and other poisons that were sent years ago into Washington, into offices in Washington, if you send a letter to your Washington office, we will not get it for about 3 weeks. It has to be screened. Now, the local offices generally will get it right away. So, you know, in your home district, if you send something, that's why I say sometimes an email letter is just as good, but we'll get it instantaneously, and you won't have to worry about if that time period, if something happens in the next 3 weeks and they haven't gotten it, it may not get through. So that's my recommendation. Just, you know, be very visible. People these days are really visible, so you want to make sure you break through the clutter so you're still on the front of mind for your member of Congress and your senator. And just keep that communication up, because your personal advocacy, you're the boss, right, of your elected official. And that's why that communication is very important.
Congressman, thank you so much. We appreciate your leadership. This is a very passionate community, and I think they'll take to heart everything that you said to us.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you. Again, however we can be helpful, we want to be.
Oh, thank you so much. Next, I want to introduce Jack Henningfield. Jack is one of the world's leading experts on addiction and the behavioral, cognitive, and central nervous system effects of drugs. He counsels clients on assessment of the abuse liability of new central nervous system acting drugs and formulations, evaluation of potential application of Controlled Substances Act to new products, and the assessment of the tamper resistance of novel formulations and development of risk management approaches. Jack frequently liaises with the Food and Drug Administration on issues concerning drug scheduling and addiction, and has presented frequently to FDA advisory committees. He has received numerous awards for his research and policy contributions to the understanding and control of tobacco addiction. He joined Pinney Associates in September '96 after 16 years of public service at the intramural research program of the National Institutes of Health, NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse, where he studied the abuse, liability, and cognitive effects of a broad range of drugs and contributed to the development of improved methods for abuse liability assessment. He's been a member of the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine faculty since 1978 and is presently adjunct professor of behavioral biology at the Medical School's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. It's clear to me he's just not qualified. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much. Stated more succinctly, I'm a scientist who believes in science in search in service of humanity. And I think, like most people, I've had in my own family members with addictions and other problems. I've had family members that have needed medicines, family members that have benefited from natural products. There's no one-size-fits-all for helping people. And I want to just tell you how I got into this, though, because I'm a scientist that studied addictive drugs and opioids, real opioids, for more than 40 years. Kratom was fascinating because here was something that looked like it had a much safer profile and really could help people and provided an alternative. And it was clear for many years now that there have been many people in Southeast Asia and increasingly in the United States treating ailments that they could have maybe were treating with opioids and other drugs. And they found that Kratom provided an acceptable and effective self-treatment. And so I believe it's really important we have alternatives available for people. And I think going forward, when you're thinking about what you can do, I think remember that NIDA, FDA, DEA have to work on this together. And anything that you can do to help show them the path and show them why the world is better, having access to Kratom will be very helpful. Don't overstate the case. There's no one-size-fits-all for everybody. Now, I met with, I got involved with the American Kratom Association last August when the DEA announced a scheduling proposal that they were going to essentially ban it by placing it in Schedule 1. My advice was that you should protest it with all you've got because it's the right thing to do, but it's too late. The train has left the station. You'll never get it reversed. But my colleagues and I at Pinney Associates believed it was the right thing, and initially we jumped on and helped them pro bono. Thanks to support of a lot of people out there, maybe some of you on this call, they have the support, they have the funding to bring on the amazing team at Hogan, Lovells, and you're going to hear from Lynn a little bit later, and our team, and they helped change, make history. When DEA actually reversed itself and at least temporarily stated its proposal. Where things are now is that the cloud still hangs overhead. So we have an opening, and we've got to take advantage of it. We met, meaning myself and representatives from the American Kratom Association with the National Institute on Drug Abuse and the Drug Enforcement Administration. I emphasize the science. I discuss Kratom in the big picture of the opioid crisis. And remember, that's something that's actually killing more than 90 people per day, and we have yet to document a true Kratom poisoning death. As I've emphasized to them, not finding it doesn't mean it hasn't happened and will never happen, but it means that the signal is very low. It means that Kratom is not a public health emergency. The other thing I emphasize is that there are now 3 different surveys that indicate that most people using Kratom are using it for some benefits. They're not using it to get high, and they're not suffering problems with it. And some percentage of people, we don't know what the percentage is, but some percentage of Kratom consumers are using it as alternatives to opioids. Either they were treating their pain with opioids and didn't like that, and were concerned about addiction, and they were pleased to find something that was satisfactory and an acceptable alternative, Or in some cases, they had problems with opioid abuse and addiction. And they found, as millions of people have found in Southeast Asia, that this can be an effective way for many people to break the opioid addiction and stay off. And so I emphasize that right now we do not have documented a public health emergency that warrants emergency scheduling and banning of kratom. But I emphasize if kratom is banned, we could create a public health emergency. I said in that case, we drive many people back to opioids, licit and illicit. And what is really scary is people, maybe like some of you, who say, you know what, I don't want to get back to opioids. I'm going to find kratom. Well, the black market then rushes in to fill the void of the lawful market. And the black market is very scary. The black market is a market. They're competitive. They may offer you kratom that they say is even better than the one you've been getting. Maybe it's kratom they lace with fentanyl. That's scary, and it's a real concern. I'm convinced that the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Food and Drug Administration are taking these issues very seriously. I'm also working with them on the real opioid crisis. They're taking that very seriously. One of the questions they have to be considering is the following. Is kratom part of the opioid problem, or is it possibly part of the solution? And at this point, we have no evidence that kratom is part of the problem. And I believe that NIDA looked at its surveys, the same surveys I looked at in our 8-factor analysis, and probably found the same thing that we did, which is there is no looming health emergency associated with kratom. They likely found what we also did in surveys, which is that if you ban it, you will drive people back to opioids and or to the illicit kratom market, which will surely emerge. And that will not likely be the market that we now have available. The other thing I emphasize is that the American Kratom Association and others support balanced regulation. Regulation that does not ban kratom or overly restrict it, but regulation that helps make sure that people get what they pay for, that their products are not adulterated, and that they're pure, that they're labeled and packaged appropriately. All of that is possible if it's regulated as an appropriate dietary substance, or even like coffee for that matter. There are many products that provide great models for kratom regulation. But if it's banned, none of those potential protections are possible. Then the only thing we can do is pray that the black market won't do what it always does. So those were some of my main messages, and they were supported by the science that we got together in our extensive 8-factor analysis document that is on the internet. I emphasize that the various surveys that have not documented kratom problems do not mean that there are no kratom problems. It means that the kratom problems are a very small signal, and we want to keep it a small signal. And the way to keep the small signal is appropriate balanced regulation, honest information to people, and let marketers that market products appropriately and safely, let them provide the products. Much better alternative than the black market. One other thing that's fascinating is kratom does have molecules, including nitrogenine, that have some opioid-like effects. And what this means is that a lot of the benefits that people attribute to kratom are probably real. Now, they have not been documented to the level that FDA would need to prove kratom as a medicine. So we have to be careful and not make those claims. Nonetheless, decades of use probably in the United States and much longer in Southeast Asia indicate that it really does help people with a lot of the ailments. And so, and some of the basic science also supports that. So we have something that I think we have some science, we need more science. And that brings me to my last point, that was an important one to the National Institute on Drug Abuse. A lot of us think that regulation is best guided by science, and that as we go forward, we want to better understand what kratom does and what it doesn't do, so we can give people even better information. Well, the only way you can let the science go forward is if you can get the product and you have support of science. If we place kratom in Schedule 1, it is very difficult to do the research. And then we don't get the regulation that we need, we don't get the research that we need, we don't get the protection in the marketplace we need. So I think what everybody on this call and more can do is make the case, make the positive case, and make it to your congressman, make it to courageous congressmen as we just heard from Congressman Pocan. The other thing that's going on that's important and relevant is the Governor Christie-led opioid commission. I think if we all put politics aside and focus and be hopeful, because he does have some people on that commission that have long histories in substance abuse. And I think what we've got to do is make sure that they understand as broadly as possible that kratom is part of the solution to the opioid problem, not the problem. And moreover, that there are people right now that are where we want them to be, off of opioids, with alternatives to opioids for pain, with alternatives to opioids for abuse. We don't want to drive them back. So those are my main messages that I carry forward. I hope, I pray, and I believe that NIDA, FDA, and DEA are really trying to find the right path, and I think if we all work together, we can help them do that.
Dr. Henningfield, thank you. Your science and your work give all of us hope. It's helped immensely when we talk to people to share your 8-factor analysis, and it's just been a godsend. Thank you very, very much.
It's my honor and pleasure. You guys are doing great work that is what I believe in, science in service of humanity.
Thank you, sir. Next, I'd like to introduce Lynn Mehler. Lynn is a partner in the pharmaceutical biotechnology practice at Hogan Lovells. She advises clients on a range of FDA and DEA regulatory matters. She's worked extensively on the approval processes for new drugs and biologics, on safety issues, on unique regulatory issues raised during the development and marketing of controlled substances. Drawing on her 12 years of experience with the FDA's Office of the Chief Counsel, Lynn has a deep understanding of the FDA. Her experience as the primary attorney handling all FDA issues related to controlled substances provides her with unique insights into both the FDA and the DEA's regulatory processes for controlled substances. She advised the agency on drug safety matters, including at approval and those leading to labeling changes, and even product withdrawal. Lynn has worked with a full range of clients. She has a deep understanding of the web of regulatory requirements governing the research and development of the controlled substances and guides companies on matters from initial clinical trials to approval and marketing. Please welcome Lynn Mehler.
Thank you, Dave. Appreciate that intro. I'm going to speak briefly tonight on a piece of legislation that's currently pending in Congress that we think may have an impact on kratom, and so I think it's important to understand a little bit about it. We're referring to it as SITSA, but it's a Stop Importation and Trafficking of Synthetic Analogs. And so the title is important to note because I think that one, you would presume the title would tell us a little bit about what it's going to do, but then I think if we look at the language of the legislation, we'll realize that it's a little broader than the title itself. You can go to the next slide. So we know well, because we were all through this, that under the current Controlled Substances Act, DEA has ample authority to immediately control substances with a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. That's what they've used to control a number of illicit synthetic fentanyls and other illicit synthetic analogs. These are the types of things that sort of become a big public health emergency, and DEA can, in the 30-day emergency process, place them in Schedule 1 and then has a number of years to move them into the normal schedules. This was the provision that DEA tried to use initially to schedule kratom, and we were able, through lots of different efforts, were able to convince them that it wasn't an appropriate fit under the science or the law. So we know they have this, we know they're using it. So to me, when I first started looking at this, the need for this law is not clear. Now, clearly DEA is struggling with the opioid epidemic, and a number of the opioids they're dealing with are synthetic, illicit, illicit substances. So it seems like that might be behind it based on the title of the act, but when you look at the statute or the legislation, you start to realize how broad it is. Next slide, please. So the law is very broad. It contains language that would let DEA control substances with a low potential for abuse based on these substances' chemical similarity to scheduled substances, including all the way down to Schedule 5 substances. And while it says DEA can temporarily schedule these substances, it's really a 5-year schedule, which really begs the question of how that's temporary. It also has a process by which they can permanently move the substances into these, what they're calling Schedule A. But they're essentially anything that has a chemical structure substantially similar to any scheduled substance, so 1 through 5, and an actual predicted effect on the central nervous system that is substantially similar to a scheduled substance 1 through 5. And the statute is vague on exactly how it is DEA should establish that. It says DEA may consider a number of factors, but does not require DEA to consider any of these factors. And some of these factors are very broad: chemical structure, relationship, binding receptor assays, and other relevant scientific information about the substance. So we know that there are other provisions like this in the Controlled Substances Act where they really rely on a chemical relationship of the moieties that allow DEA to sweep other substances in, separate and apart from kratom. And we have seen over time that DEA uses that authority very broadly. And so we're looking at this and saying, well, what will they use? What can they use this authority to sweep in? And despite the reference to synthetics in the title of the legislation, the draft, the law, the language itself doesn't actually limit it to synthetic substances, but just talks about substances. So that could be interpreted, and there's certainly precedent throughout the Controlled Substances Act that when it talks about substances, that could be natural, botanical, synthetic. It really doesn't distinguish. So because the statutory language, the proposed statutory language, doesn't limit it to synthetics, our concern is that kratom could fit into this paradigm when you recognize that we know certain things about its chemical structure that relate to other controlled substances, and the fact that the standard for which DEA establishes that the substance has a similar effect is broad and vague and rather easy to meet, because so many things can sort of fit underneath it. Next slide, please. So we think that this law may be unconstitutional. We certainly think it's unreasonably broad given what we think the intent of the law is. We think that if enacted, it could substantially curtail and burden dietary supplements and products like kratom. We think it curtails and could stymie legitimate scientific research and product development across, not just dietary supplements, natural botanicals, but also drug products. While there's an exception for substances that are under investigation for use as a drug, it's a very, very narrow exception, so it's likely to hit the pharmaceutical world as well. And as we noted before, this gives DEA the authority to control the substance for 5 years without providing any opportunity to comment without being able to challenge it in either administratively, to challenge DEA's decision, or in the courts. So no legal challenges, no scientific challenges as it's written. And it would also have higher penalties related to these products than you would see with other drugs in the same class. So, for example, DEA might, if they conclude the substance should be in Schedule A because its relationship to a Schedule 5 drug, in the end you end up with penalties that are higher for the Schedule A drug than the drug that it's similar to. And so that's just not a rational result to the legislation. So that's in a nutshell what we see when we read this provision. So Dave, I'd like to happy to turn it over to you. I think Mac Haddow comes next, and he has all sorts of great insight.
Well, Lynn, thank you. You've made the unexplainable understandable. In our community, there's a tremendous amount of questioning, all of it legitimate, trying to find the answers to, will this create a kratom problem, will it not? And, your advice throughout all of this has helped us understand that the risk is a very real risk. So, again, thank you so very much.
Sure.
Our chief lobbyist is Mac Haddow. Mac has more than 34 years of experience in the public policy arena, initially serving, I can't read that, but it doesn't matter, I know what it is, the campaign manager for Senator Orrin Hatch, personally serving as the youngest member of the Utah legislature, where he was Legislator of the Year, and serving in the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and HHS, Health and Human Services, in the Reagan administration, where he was Chief of Staff. While at HHS, and for a 9-month period, he was the acting administrator of the Healthcare Finance Administration, that you might know now as CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Studies. And Mac has a broad experience in both designing grassroots lobbying campaigns and delivering client messages with impact as a result of actually having been there. Mac?
Dave, thank you. I'm glad to join you here this evening to share some of my thoughts about this battle that we've taken on, and it has been remarkable. I have spent actually more than 40 years in this business looking at and helping as an advocate clients to navigate this labyrinth in Washington. And I can tell you that in my experience that there have been no better champions than Congressman Mark Pocan and Senator Orrin Hatch. Their bipartisan cooperation and collaboration in doing what they have done have made them the real champions of our battle up on the Hill. And we've had remarkable successes to date too. We know that the DEA withdrew its emergency scheduling order back in October after the outcry from the community and from the Congress and from the scientists and from the veterans and from the medical professionals, all of whom challenged the thinking that had been put into and formulated into that Federal Register notice that threatened to ban kratom from the people that use it and rely upon it and wanted to have the freedom to continue to do so. Since that time, and by the way, that was an unprecedented action. I think that Jack Henningfield said it earlier, that when we started that battle, there was a lot of healthy skepticism, because in 80 previous attempts by the DEA to use the emergency scheduling powers that had been granted to them by the Congress back in 1983, they had been successful in every single one of them. There wasn't one instance where that emergency scheduling order had been rescinded until October 13th of 2016. And it was the kratom community that forced them to do so, because we discredited the so-called science that they were using that claimed that there were deaths and medical events that kratom was actually dangerous and dangerously addictive. We proved that that simply wasn't the case. After that order was rescinded, the FDA was asked by the DEA to produce its 8-factor analysis by December 1st of 2016. Here we sit today at the end of June in 2017, and the FDA has not done so. In a hearing that was held, an oversight hearing that Congressman Pocan referenced, he asked the new FDA commissioner, Dr. Gottlieb, what the status of that 8-factor analysis was. And Dr. Gottlieb, who was aware that the question was going to be asked in advance, only could say that it's still under consideration at the FDA. And the reason that it's so difficult for them to follow through with this 8-factor analysis is that the American Kratom Association commissioned Dr. Henningfield to do his own 8-factor analysis, and he used the very same literature and scientific research to base his 8-factor analysis that mirrors what the FDA has to do. And so if the FDA were to produce an 8-factor analysis today, they would have to, in some fashion, discredit what Dr. Henningfield did, but they can't, because that information is the public record that they have to use, and it was Dr. Henningfield's conclusion that there is no dangerous level of addiction and that kratom is safe for consumer consumption as properly regulated under the Dietary Supplement Act. It is not a drug, and that's what the FDA and DEA tried to make it into. Since then, we've gone through a very difficult legislative season that started with the state legislatures that started in January. We saw that in Florida, in New York, in West Virginia, Maine, Utah, and Oregon, we had various efforts to ban or to schedule kratom into a controlled substance position where it would be unavailable to consumers. We won in every state, with the exception of Oregon, where it's still pending, but the Oregon proposal was to study whether or not kratom should be, and we produced for them Dr. Henningfield's 8-factor analysis, and we've been told by the committee chairman that are overseeing that legislative pathway that satisfies the requirement, and they see no reason to proceed with that legislation. So we have, in effect, one in 6 states. That's largely because of the kratom community that unified behind this effort in order to make certain that state legislatures weren't going to be duped by the information, the false information that was coming out of the DEA. With the current legislation sponsored by Representative Katko in the House and Senators Feinstein and Grassley, there's a real controversy that swirled within our own community and among some up in the Senate and the House as to whether or not this legislation would actually cover kratom. That analysis that was provided to you by Lynn clearly showed that there are big holes in this legislation that would allow the DEA to take advantage of the statutory authority granted to them under CITSA to schedule kratom into Schedule A. And that Schedule A is a dangerous place to be. And I'll describe that in just a second. But I sat in front of a 26-year-old staffer yesterday who asked me a direct question, and she said, why do you not want to trust the Drug Enforcement Administration? They've told us that they really don't see kratom being scheduled in Schedule A under this legislation. Well, that's an interesting question, and I know it's one that some skeptics in our own community have asked. But I told her that when I was a young staffer like her, I worked for Senator Hatch and Senator Kennedy in the evaluation of the nuclear test site facility out in Nevada, and the question then was whether or not the radiation fallout from that nuclear testing was responsible for tens of thousands of deaths and leukemia cases and cancer cases in the Nevada and southern Utah communities. The scientists at the time swore and showed documentation that they claimed to have produced that radiation was not unsafe. And in fact, they claimed that children with the fallout that fell upon cars that looked like a layer of snow, the children were playing in it and actually drawing designs on cars with that radiation dust. We know today, as a result of those hearings, that in fact it was terribly unsafe, that it was dangerous, but the government kept saying that there was no safety factor, whatever. And so that's why I'm a skeptic when it comes to the government saying, oh, don't worry, we won't do anything to you. Chairman Gomert, in the recent hearing about CITSA, asked the DEA Acting Assistant Secretary for Diversion Control, Ms. Ashley, whether or not CITSA would cover kratom. And her answer was fascinating. She didn't say, no, the CITSA Act will not cover kratom. No, we will not schedule it. She said, we're not on that track to put kratom into Schedule A. She said the FDA is conducting an 8-factor analysis, and our path is to wait for that analysis. She didn't say that if they don't give us the analysis, and the opportunity presents itself, and if a DEA agent or an enterprising prosecutor wants to schedule it under Schedule A, they can do so. So that's why we need to be skeptical and why we need to tighten down and amend the CITSA Act to make sure that they are foreclosed from that option. The CITSA Act does not require any medical or scientific evaluation from the FDA, from the National Institutes of Drug Abuse, or the HHS Assistant Secretary for Health. Not one scientist, not one analysis will be required for the Attorney General to put kratom or other substances that they decide to put into Schedule A on their 5-year temporary scheduling basis. And more importantly, there will be no judicial review when they do so. That's in the statute. The option for the Attorney General to make the scheduling permanent is allowed in that legislation during that initial 5-year period. And again, we won't have any opportunity to challenge it. They can also schedule, even as Lynn pointed out, products that have a very low addiction potential. And so how could it be, given the record that they have established in the Federal Register, why wouldn't they take advantage if the door were open to them to schedule kratom, because they didn't like the fact that they had to withdraw it? Today, we have in our hands over 16,000 petitions from the kratom community. We'd like to have more, and we encourage all of you to join in and actually sign those and put them in. Get your family and your friends to do it, because as Congressman Pocan said earlier, that voice is an important one. People will listen. We're going to ask you to do more things, including making those individual calls to the district offices of those members in the districts where you live. Those are voices that need to be heard by these members once we determine who the key people will be. The House Judiciary staff has agreed that they will already work on amendments to the CITSA Act in order to alleviate these concerns. We have similar commitments from the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator Grassley's staff said they're willing to discuss these amendments because they can see that they do in fact pose a threat. And just yesterday I learned that Senator Feinstein, her staff was very upset with the number of calls that they were getting from the kratom community, because all of you responded and started making those calls. They were a little upset, but now they're willing to talk as well. Our timeline for this is that we need to slow this down so that it doesn't get railroaded through. The DEA has asked, and the Attorney General has asked the Congress to put this on the fast track, because they claim they need this scheduling authority in order to interdict all the fentanyls that are out there. And we understand that. And we're supportive of them being able to interdict legitimate synthetic products that are killing people. But it should not be done in an irresponsible fashion. And I think that's where our challenge is to make sure that we let them look closely at this and find the right kinds of amendments that will tighten this law up. Why don't we just trust the FDA and the DEA? Those were the people that said that there were 30 deaths associated with the consumption of kratom. That was discredited. They said that there were hundreds and hundreds of serious adverse medical events that were documented by the Poison Control Center data, and we found that was untrue. They said that kratom gives you a high that is equivalent to opioids, and we know that isn't true. The science disputed it and proved it was untrue. They said that kratom is a drug, and it is not. It is a natural botanical. The DEA doesn't today list tobacco or alcohol, and yet they talk about kratom as being somehow dangerously addictive. Fentanyl, which is a painkiller that is approximately 80 to 100 times more powerful than heroin, is only on Schedule 2 in the Controlled Substances Act. And the DEA claims that every decision they make comes down to the science. The reason we can't trust them is that when you give authority of this magnitude to a law enforcement agency, they will have the discretion to go out and use it, and they likely will. Everett Dirksen used to talk about the Congress, and he said that the Congress had the power to do any damn fool thing that they wanted, and they usually did about every 10 seconds. Well, I think that's true about the DEA and the FDA, and they verified it with their actions on kratom. President Reagan used to say that we can trust people, but we need to verify, and that's where we need to be. What we have today is a modern-day David versus Goliath story. We won a battle back in September, and of course culminating in the October 13th withdrawal that stunned the Washington community. They took notice. We now have the ability to close the deal. When Jack Henningfield and I met with the National Institutes of Drug Abuse staff, They told us that had they been consulted by the DEA prior to their attempting to schedule kratom as under their emergency scheduling authority, and they were not consulted, they would have told them that the science that they have and the research they have is consistent with what Dr. Henningfield's 8-factor analysis concluded, and that is that kratom should not be scheduled. In the next go-round, when the FDA comes back with their 8-factor analysis, if they do, and if they attempt to recommend scheduling of kratom, statutorily, they have to seek the advice and cooperation and approval of NIDA. I don't think they're going to be able to get it because Dr. Henningfield's study is persuasive, it's powerful, and it disputes the premise upon which they're going to act. There's no question that we sit here today having reached and achieved these successes because of the kratom community, because all of you out there, and I can tell you that as in my experience with advocacy efforts, there hasn't been a stronger voice, there hasn't been a more unified voice in any effort than what I saw with this group. And so I'm honored to work with Dave and with Pete and with all of you to carry that message as best I can, and I can only report on it and amplify it a little because your voices drowned out the opposition, and I salute you for it, and I'm looking forward to continuing this battle so that we can not only win against CITSA, we can force the FDA to affirmatively say that kratom should not be, in fact, scheduled, and then we can go back to those 6 states where it's currently not available to consumers, and we can get those state laws rescinded as well, because at the bottom line, consumers have the right to have the freedom to make their own choices about their health and well-being with safe botanical products, and that's what kratom is.
Mac, wonderful, just wonderful. These presentations tonight were a thought process that we put together in the theory that it's not about the AKA, it's about the community. And we have some very specific areas that we work in, and tonight we shared 4 of those with you. We brought in Congress, lawyers, science, and lobbying, and these are well-credentialed people. So we hope you found these presentations educational and informative, and that it very much tied in to a lot of the things that we've been trying to share as well, and we want you to share with us. So please let us know what you thought. Hopefully we hit a good button with you. We wanted to. And to close it tonight, we'd like Pete Candland to come on, and we've been asking for questions and let him answer a few for you. But again, thank you, and thank you for sharing with us as part of the community. Pete?
Dave, thank you very much, and I want to thank everyone again for attending this webinar. We had one, boy, it was a couple months ago that was very well attended. We were able to provide some good information, and I think this one with the folks that we were able to bring on also provided some great information as well. I want to thank everyone for their support of the AKA and our fight to keep kratom legal. I think one of the questions I get asked most often is, why does the AKA request donations? I think it's clear, and if you don't know, we operate 100% off of the donations of the kratom community. The vast majority of our donations come from individual contributors. Just stating it plainly, it costs a lot of money to bring in the experts that we have, the experts that we had on tonight, Dr. Henningfield, Mac Haddow, the law firm. These are good folks that we want to keep with us on our team. So please consider donating at, I have the link on the screen, at americankratom.org/donate. Another question that I have is, well, you get these donations, how can I find out how the donations are spent? Our 990s, our tax returns, are available upon request. You can go to our website, americankratom.org. You can contact me directly, and I can provide that information to you. There were a lot of other questions that I received that requested a lot more detail, and I think instead of talking about those questions tonight, I'll answer those back individually. But I just wanted to thank everyone again. Dave, thank you for leading this meeting, and I appreciate everyone enjoying this fight as we protect kratom.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you all. We hope to talk to you again very soon.